Thank you, Rabbi Davidson, for your ongoing personal friendship. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your love of Israel. Thank you for your incredible leadership in American Jewish life in general. I had the privilege of seeing you in action many, many years ago in Westchester County, and I admired then and I admire now your efforts to connect Jews and non-Jews alike to Judaism and to the State of Israel. I don't have to tell you, Temple Emanu-El is one of the most famous and influential congregations in the world. I'm humbled and honored to have been asked to address you today. I value and cherish my association with the temple, with its leadership, and with your various programs such as the Stryker Center and many others. With your permission, on this special Rosh Hashana, I would like to share a few thoughts before I take your questions. Here's a little known historical fact. Between mid-19th century until 1924, over 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe and moved to North America. This tremendous wave of newcomers, among them the founders of this very congregation, shaped American Jewry until this very day. All this ended with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 that was meant to block immigration from Asia, Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Unknowingly and tragically, America's legislators almost 100 years ago doomed to death millions of Jews who were left behind in Europe, unable to come to America. Some of the biggest Jewish philanthropists of the time, like the Baron Morris Hirsch, were actively involved in settling Jews in places such as Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, New Jersey, and even Argentina. But during those 8 decades of massive Jewish immigration to North America, only a handful of Jews came to the Holy Land, including my own family, the Aronovs, who settled in Jerusalem in 1874. The idea of establishing a national movement for the Jewish people, namely the Zionist movement, was not embraced by the overwhelming majority of Jews. Driven by religious fervor or by ideological and entrepreneurial zeal, and in some cases by both, the pioneers acted against all odds. On this Rosh Hashanah, because of COVID-19, because of the fact that this year has been hard, I would like to celebrate what is rather than what if. Today, the State of Israel is the home of the world's largest Jewish community. Jewish life, although not free of tension and strife, are blossoming. The modern State of Israel is a bastion of creativity and innovation. Israel's universities are consistently ranked in the top, and Israeli ideas are considered hot commodity worldwide. Who would have imagined that Israeli content would be welcomed and celebrated in Hollywood the way it is? Who would have believed that Israel would send the 3rd largest contingent to NASDAQ, more than countries such as Germany or Japan or Great Britain? Who would have believed that the country that started with less than 600,000 residents in 1948 is projected to reach the 17 million people mark by 2048, when Israel will be celebrating 100 years? Not only that Zionism has never been more accepted among American Jews, and make no mistake, the majority of American Jews are still find it very difficult to embrace Zionism. But there is a new generation of young Jews and people of Jewish background that, unlike their forefathers, see Israel as a place of opportunity and not just as a country plagued by seemingly insurmountable problems. This paradigm shift from Israel as a problem to Israel as an opportunity can be largely attributed to 2 things. The first person who deserves credit has nothing to do with Jewish life and has nothing to do with the State of Israel. And he's gone. His name is Steve Jobs. In 2007, Steve Jobs changed the world by introducing the first smartphone, which allowed people to self-design their own informational feeds, thus eliminating the prominence of the VIPs of the old world, the editors and the gatekeepers. Those who benefited from self-perpetuating Israel's unhappy geopolitical hardships, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinians, were quickly replaced within less than a decade by vibrant and transparent online conversation. Israelis themselves are now the chief communicators of their country to the world, and not their political leadership, and not the pundits and the commentators. Millions of Israelis are communicating their lives in Israel to their peers globally, and they do it authentically, reliably, and attractively. My daughter and my son-in-law, both of them, work for global companies, Checkpoint and Google, and they spend all day, every day, with their peers overseas, and they work, but they also communicate their lives. They exchange pictures, they exchange ideas, they exchange experiences. This is the main explanation as to the tremendous growth in Israel's incoming tourism, as well as the dramatic spike in the amount of money that the Israeli economy is able to attract, foreign money. The second credit goes obviously to what we call experiential marketing. Programs such as Birthright, Masa, JNF's, Must High School, and many other similar programs allow young people to experience Israel firsthand with either no mediation or very minimal mediation. It was once said by a prominent American broadcaster after he visited Israel. He said the following: if given a chance, Israel could sell itself. In many cases, it was us, the Israelis, who wouldn't give Israel a chance by communicating Israel through a very narrow, one-dimensional aspect of the conflict. But we see it time and again. Nothing is stronger than experiencing the place. From a geopolitical perspective, Israel has never been more accepted and never enjoyed more international legitimacy. The Arab economic boycott of 1945 is rapidly fading as our Arab neighbors strive to turn their economies into knowledge-based economies. They look around with concern as their oil reserves are depleting and the world is gradually shifting to more responsible consumption in accordance with the principles of sustainability. And by the way, if you ask me personally, the COVID-19 crisis, in my humble opinion, will provide a significant boost to the climate change conversation. So those Arab leaders arrive at the inevitable solution. We need, they say to themselves, to redesign the foundations of our economies if we want to survive and remain competitive in the 21st century. And looking around, Israel is the most immediate strategic partner for regimes aspiring to adopt to the new technological realities. There are many indications that the United Arab Emirates deal is only the beginning. Globally, Israel is enjoying an unprecedented level of intimacy with the world's greatest powers: the United States, China, India, Russia, Brazil, Great Britain. In Africa, we have an unprecedented level of intimacy with countries such as Nigeria and others. Add to that the traditional intimacy that we have with Canada, with Germany, and with Australia, with other countries. Indeed, we have a problem with some classical European countries and certainly in some parts of the Arab and the Muslim world. And we do have a problem with some intellectual circles where we still hear those who try to doubt Israel's legitimacy. But please do know that Israel is not being boycotted. On the contrary, it is being celebrated globally, even in the Arab world. As for the global intellectual elite, They never endorsed Zionism. Yet the movement was able to thrive and overachieve without their support. This is not to say that the intellectual elite is unimportant. This is not to say that we need to ignore it, but we need to see things in the right perspective. So on this Rosh Hashana, after 6 months of global pandemic, wasn't easy. I'd like to send you from the hills of Judea, from my beautiful home here near Jerusalem, our warmest wishes for a sweet new year, one of health, prosperity, and happiness. I'll be more than happy to take your questions, please. Well, Mark, I wish I had enough time to answer your question properly. I would need a few hours to do that. But let me concentrate on three biggest misconceptions in my view. The first is that Israel is defined by conflict. Israel has more to offer the world than conflict. The reason why Israel is defined by conflict, because whenever we were given a chance to communicate our country to the world, we only spoke about our problems with our enemies, with our adversaries, and so on. I think that the younger generation is not there anymore. I mean, the younger generation, again, the self-designed feed, they're interested in their thing, whether it's food or fashion or design, and Israel has a lot to offer in those areas. The second misconception is that Israel is defined by orthodoxy only. And again, that's part of the way Israel is being portrayed in Hollywood. But the truth is that Israel is a celebration of diversity. We have over 80 different ethnic groups represented, almost 100 languages regularly spoken. You look at the spices and the tastes and the flavors and so on. Israel is a celebration of diversity. That's a second misconception. And lastly, a third misconception is that Israeli creativity is limited only to technology. Not true. Israeli creativity is manifested in all walks of life, including Israeli cuisine, arts and culture, literature, and so on and so forth. So from the kitchen to the dance floor, we celebrate Israeli creativity. Robert, your question is very profound. I would say that there are two answers to your question. The first is yes, the original mission remains the same, and that is to be a safe haven to all Jews. Whether you support Israel or not, the Nazis didn't care whether you were 1/2 Jewish or 25% Jewish. If you were a Jew 2 generations back, you were eligible, quote unquote, for persecution. So remaining a safe haven is still the mission statement. I would add to that the promise to be a place of opportunity. Right now, one of the ways you measure opportunity is income per capita. Right now, income per capita in Israel is fast approaching the European level. In fact, income per capita in Israel today is about $44,000 a year per person, is more than most countries in the OECD. But once we will close the gap with the United States, and I believe that the average income in the United States is over $50,000 a year, then Israel and the United States, from an opportunity point of view, the task of making a living, of earning enough to live life, will be on an equal footing. And I think that will be really the turning point. It will be a game changer once GDP per capita per annum in Israel will reach the American level. So yes, Stephen, I do believe that the agreement with the UAE is hugely significant because of two reasons. The first is it's a proof positive to the new American paradigm. Whether you like it or not, President Trump introduced a disruptive form of foreign relations. He said, the hell with even-handedness. You break it, you pay. Meaning the Palestinians had a chance to create their own independent state. 3 times they rejected territorial compromise offers. And therefore, according to Trump, they have to pay. What does it mean they have to pay? They've been sidelined. The foreign policy plan doesn't really include them. Either they want to be part of the discussion, come to the table, but if not, We're moving forward. And because of all the reasons I mentioned before, it became easier. So you have a new paradigm where no longer the Palestinians hold the veto power on normalization between Israelis and Arabs. Huge, huge development, good development. Um, and the second, of course, significance stems from the fact, as I mentioned before, the natural resources are still important, but not as nearly as important as they were. The world is moving to alternative energy. The world is moving to knowledge-based economies, and the Arab leaders want to be part of that. They don't want to lag behind. So Beth, you're asking me what other countries are ripe for normalizing ties with Israel. I would say Qatar, because Qatar has always been independent thinker in the Arab world. I would say Oman. Oman already had Israeli diplomatic representation in the past. Definitely Sudan, Bahrain, that has a big issue with Iran. And the Holy Grail will be obviously the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which I believe will follow suit. So the question Neil is asking is definitely a very profound one about the quality of the relationship between the vast majority of American Jews and the current political leadership of the State of Israel. I would say this to you, Neil. First of all, don't confuse Israeli leadership with Israeli people. Two different things. Sometimes, as I said before, the leadership has its own interests. Sometimes the leadership is self-centered. Sometimes the leadership is ethnocentric. I think that you will find in Israel many allies and many friends. However, and I say this as someone who's married to an American, whose children are American, spent 20 years in the United States, I think it's a mistake, and I say this to many, many Jews, that view everything that is happening in the American political system through the Israel prism only. There are people that are connected to Israel very, very strongly, and that's what they do, and that's fine. But to expect others whose connections are not so strong, I think it's not working. It's ineffective. I'm reminded this great story about the meeting that took place in 1961, not far from you, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel between JFK and Ben Gurion. And there was a big age difference between the two of them, as you know, and JFK wanted to be polite. At the end of the meeting, he asked Ben Gurion, "What can I do for you, Mr. Prime Minister?" And Ben Gurion famously answered, "You can be the best president you can for the United States. This is what you can do for us." And I would say the same thing to you. What Israel needs is to be viewed as a normal place. Now, it's true that Israelis themselves will tell you, well, we're not normal. We're an abnormal place. Show me another place that is surrounded by so many threats and so many challenges. And it's true. But I would say even given those hardships, we're still far more normal than people think. And we need to celebrate that normalcy. Kim, your question about the United Nations is a very good one. I have to say that unfortunately and sadly, the United Nations is rapidly declining in influence and effectiveness, and it's a result of long-standing ineptitude, and obviously the fact that they did not foresee the technological revolution that dramatically disrupted traditional diplomacy. Most of the tasks of traditional diplomacy were taken away by the information revolution. So the United Nations, sadly, is less relevant than ever. And perhaps COVID-19 will give rise to a new conversation about upgrading or even changing the United Nations and creating a more collaborative form of international relations. We have to remember the origins of the United Nations. After World War II, the world was traumatized. 51 nations got together in San Francisco. Later on, it became a group of 55. Today, 193 members, most of them non-democracies, and they are given a chance to vote in a democratic institution while they're not really advocates of democracy. That's the tragedy of the United Nations. So Kim is asking about the impact on Israel's economy. Definitely, tourism This you have to know is the single largest industry in the country. It employs 1.3 million people that provide for nearly 3.5 million people, which is more than 1/3 of the Israeli population. And so it was hit hard. We had experienced a string of record-breaking years in incoming tourism. Today, domestic tourism is the only name of the game. What are the solutions? Two things that you can do. The first is participate in virtual tourism tours where you can have access to Israeli sites and Israeli tour guides via Zoom. I know that the Jewish National Fund is launching an initiative like that. And the second is when travel resumes, please do prioritize Israel as your first overseas destination. So people travel to Tuscany. Well, Israel is only 2 hours away from Tuscany. People travel to the Greek islands. Well, Israel is only an hour and a half from the Greek islands. Israel is only 3 hours from Spain or 4 hours from Spain, and so on. I agree with you, Alex. I agree with you that the relationship is souring, mostly because there is a group of young people, Jews and non-Jews alike, that is disconnected, you could say disenfranchised, definitely indifferent when it comes to the conflict. I believe that the onus in this case is on Israel to better connect with them by highlighting universal values like sustainability, like social justice and others, and help them find a way to connect with Israel and with Judaism. I think that it's a big problem as Israel is becoming more and more self-centered, more and more preoccupied with its own domestic and regional problems. I think we have a tendency to forget the importance of that universal conversation. I hope I answered your questions to your satisfaction. And again, I'd like to wish all of you on this special Rosh Hashanah a happy and sweet and healthy New Year. Keep safe. Greetings.